Hello, friends. Welcome back to Heartscapes, where we are practicing the system of Reiki at the intersection of self reflection, spiritual practice, and social action. My name is Michaela, and I'm welcoming you back to the studio today. Really glad you're here. Today is the beginning of a new series that I've been thinking about and percolating in my mind for quite some time because in the line of work that I have been in for the last 10 years, I get to meet so many folks who are doing work with similar goals, similar methods, or similar places in the heart that they're coming from that have these really delicious intersections with the work that I'm doing with Reiki. And I love exploring those points of commonality, those points of intersection, and finding those points of difference between the work that I do and other modalities, other perspectives, other traditions. And so I've been wanting to have conversations with folks where I'm finding these points of intersection and really explore them, tease them out a little bit more, and perhaps find ways in which we can work together to strengthen what we are up to in the world. And so this is the first such conversation, and I'm really excited to welcome a friend and colleague to join me today. So let me welcome her in. So Meena, you and I met through our business training program, actually. We get to be in a really amazing community of folks that are working to build businesses that change the world, that are heartful, that are values focused, and that are really focused on helping people to be their best. And so it felt like the perfect place to begin these conversations. So Meena, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself and to talk a little bit about what drew you to the Akashic Records, which is the modality that you teach and practice.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. My name is Meena Ruchi. I'm an Akashic record reader and meditation instructor. And more than that, I think it's like I love these two tools, and I'm really just a fangirl of both of them. Like I really, really adore them. So yeah, I'd love to explain what the Akashic records are if people haven't heard of them. So some people describe the Akashic records as the subtle energetic imprint of everything that has ever happened, everything that is currently happening, and everything that could possibly happen in the future. So it's the energetic compendium of infinity and eternity. And because that is very vague and hard to grasp, the way that I like to think about it is if you could imagine an invisible library in space that has books on every subject you could imagine, including you or your own soul or essence. In an Akashic record reading, when I work with someone one-on-one, it's like we're checking out the book on you, and you have the opportunity to ask questions and receive insight from an elevated perspective. So if you have big, burning existential questions, this is the perfect modality for you, because you can literally in a reading ask things like, why am I here? What is my purpose? What are my gifts? How am I meant to be of service? How can I improve my relationships? And things like that. So it's a very inherently mysterious and kind of magical modality. And I was drawn to them because I had always wondered what my purpose was from the time I was like a pretty young kid. And I also had this sense of urgency. I had anxiety pretty much my whole life. Some of my earliest memories were being like very scared and anxious as like a baby. And so that anxiety and that curiosity and like wondering made that sense of urgency. And so I really just felt like I had no time to lose. I was like, we got to figure this out and like get stuff done. So I dabbled with all kinds of different self-help books, and that was just my hobby as a teenager, was just exploration of purpose and anything that kind of touched on that in some way. And When I went to college, I had like a pretty tough time. The anxiety got worse. Everything kind of like descended into chaos. And that wondering of why am I here took on a really like dark and kind of sour note. And it kind of became, why am I here? I don't need to be here. And it was just like my own fear and the anxiety that kept me going, because I was like worried that if I didn't finish school, I would never get a job and I would become like homeless and unable to take care of myself. So that was like the fear that I was like working very hard to avoid. I didn't want that to come to fruition. And when I finally graduated, I graduated in the middle of the pandemic in May of 2020. And all of the companies that I was hiring or interviewing with went on a hiring freeze. And so I was forced to pause. And I had nothing to do. I was done with school and didn't have a job. And so I just was like, I need something to kill the time. And I still had that like wondering and that desperation of like, why am I here? I need to figure this out. And now I've like spent all this time in school. What am I doing? I felt very lost, very stuck, super confused. And like the uncertainty I was feeling about everything was really overwhelming. And it was the most apparent thing was, I don't know. I don't know. And I need help. And so I stumbled upon this course about the Akashic Records. And what really intrigued me about them was that it seemed like it was a protected system. And that fascinated me. It wasn't the way I had heard about psychics or intuitive people where you go get a reading and they just tell you information. The thing about the records that fascinated me was you ask a question and then you receive a response. It wasn't just random information coming through that you didn't want to know about, because I was scared of hearing something I didn't want to hear. And because when that happens, when you're kind of given like unsolicited information, it sticks with you and it's hard to shake it off. And so that seemed so appealing. And I was like, yeah, let's like give it a go. Maybe you can ask about purpose. And I also didn't think the Akashic Records were a real thing. I was just trying to pass the time because it doesn't sound like a real thing. And so I was like, it'll just be fun. And I was really blown away when it worked. And I was able to ask those big existential questions I had around purpose and gifts and potential. And they responded. And it was so magical, so life-changing for me. And it was deeply calming and bolstering. It gave me the strength to finally admit that I knew, I'd known for a long time, I didn't want to be doing what I had been studying all that time. And there was something else available for me. I could feel that potential in the records. And so that finally is what gave me the strength to kind of lay down what had been dead for a long time and change slowly the course that I was going in, the direction I was going in. And so that's kind of how I arrived here.
Wow. That's a really compelling journey, and and a very compelling place to start, that this is the energetic compendium of eternity and infinity, right? What a compelling and totally esoteric and confusing place to start, which already feels like an interesting overlap with the system of Reiki, because we've got some of that going on in that system as well. But I love hearing a little bit more about just that meandering road that you took with this through line of this question about purpose, and kind of landing at a place where there was a space where you could ask that question and trust the answers that were coming to you. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was meandering. I love that word. It was like, it felt so directionless and aimless and hopeless at times too.
Yeah.
So yeah, if people are in that space, it's okay.
It is. It's not, yeah, it's not only okay, but it's so common to our human experience, and there's kind of there's a particular model or archetype around our life's journey, our vocational journey, that I think is a little bit stuck in time, in a particular time in our history. I'm thinking kind of the, first half of the 20th century, where you picked a path and you went to school for that thing and you got an entry level job in that thing and you worked your way up and then you retired. And that was, it was a very linear idea of how we come into our purpose and we come into our vocation. And what I have experienced in my own life to be true, what I experienced when I worked in career services for a few years when I was working in universities, is that that's a very contrived and rigid and unnatural structure for us to find our vocational path. And much more often, it's what you're describing, where there's these breadcrumbs of questions and interests or moments of despair, roadblocks, following one thread that feels really fascinating or important, and then, getting to the end of it and finding it's just really not that meaningful to you, or there's some other thing in the way, but then pulling that thread into something else. It's a much more dynamic and spiraling and meandering journey for most of us than I think this kind of myth presents itself. And I like to point that out in these kinds of conversations, because I think there's still, even though that has changed so much as far as how we understand how people come to their vocation, I think there's still a little bit of shame around a path like that, and like not knowing where you're going, or shame, and also some anxiety about, oh, I'm 29, I should have figured it out by now, or, oh, I'm not doing what I went to school for, there's something wrong with me. I went to school for art history. I was going to be an art history professor, and I love that I did that. And I love that I have that in my background, and a worldview that comes from, intensive study of creative process over time. And like, that's definitely not what I ever did for a living. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I was like laughing, like trying not to burst into like fits of laughter when you were like, yeah, there's some shame and anxiety around that. So I'm like, yes, there is. It was excruciating. And even now, I sometimes still feel that, because I found the records 2 weeks after I graduated with my master's. So it was like horrifying for my whole family for me to kind of just like let that go immediately after crossing that huge threshold, that finish line, that starting line. And yeah, it's hilarious now, but at the time it was not so funny. It was rough.
Yeah. 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 I went to grad school some years after undergrad, and, chose a program that was very specifically aligned with the work I had been doing for the 10 years in between, and which was social justice leadership development. And, I felt like I was at this crossroads of like, I either need to double down on what I've been doing, right? This would be the wise career move, to like build on what you've done for 10 years, get, a higher ed degree in that, and, off you go. But also knowing that there were significant parts of that work, the way I had been doing it, that were not actually true to my gifts and my inclinations. Or I choose a completely different path that's terrifying. And that means, yeah, throwing away all of this time and following, this other thread that feels like, creative endeavor and spiritual practice and supporting people from the inside out. And, much less about what we're doing about the problems in the world, and much more about how we're being with ourselves inside of that. And it felt like this choice that I had to make. And I chose the wise, prudent, practical path. And then, the universe played this amazing trick on me, which was that the program that I chose, which was at a Catholic university, actually, that had a very strong, both spiritual and social justice, through line in how they operate. Like immediately they looked at me and said, why do you think those are two different things? Why do you think that people doing social justice work don't need people doing what you're talking about, who understand them and their world, and who need help from the inside? And the coursework was so much about self-reflection and introspection, and coming to a sense of our essential nature. And they were just like thrilled that I wanted to do this totally other thing that seemed completely wacky to me. So I feel very lucky in that sense that I kind of chose this path, and then that path was like, ah, just kidding, you need to come back over here.
That's beautiful. How like, yeah, what a beautiful like confirmation. You're so safe and protected and guided. That's amazing. Like you can't make a wrong choice.
Yeah, it was frustrating at the time, but it was funny. Like you said, later it was hilarious.
Later, it's funny
And
later.
one of my cohort members ended up being my first long-term client. It was like there was like money where your mouth is kind of validation that came. She's like, yes, I do in fact need you to do this work, and I will pay you to do it. So um, anyway, we took a little side quest there about vocational path, but but I love finding these similarities not just in our work but in our journey. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm so curious about how your approach to Reiki is different because it strikes me as super unique, so reverent of the roots and the origins, super educated, and like anchored in the ground, but aware of the world, like anchored in the self and aware of what's going on around us too. It's not ignoring realities that are occurring and hiding within the self or trying to escape it. So, and you said that your like program in the beginning, kind of that crossroads, was like deep self inquiry and exploration. So I'd love to know how you use Reiki with that deep self exploration, because I haven't heard of Reiki being used that way. I think of
Yeah.
it as
Yeah.
energy work, body work.
Right. Right. Yeah. So when I first studied Reiki, which really was came out of a time of personal crisis in my life and really looking for primarily things that can help me, feel better and feel more grounded in healthy relationships. But also, still in kind of codependent patterns of if I can make other people feel good, then I will feel good, right? If I can make the people around me feel better and be healed and whole, then I will feel that way. And so, the way in which Western Reiki holds the practice was well aligned with that because it is focusing on one of the five elements of the system from its original form, which is the hands-on healing kind of energy work, primarily from one person to another. So kind of an external, sharing a healing modality with other people to heal what ails them. And that was definitely what I was looking for at the time. But over time, studying with my teacher for a number of years, taking more and more classes that, took me more in the direction of more New Age Western versions of the practice, I became less and less satisfied. And there were two main reasons for that I would come to understand. Firstly, there was this sense that I had of a deeper spiritual reservoir of like this groundwater down below that my roots hadn't quite touched. There was something I wasn't getting, something that wasn't available to me in the way that I was practicing. And the more complex systems that I studied, the further away it felt like I was getting. And the other piece was that I started to acknowledge something that had always been present, which was that I felt really out of integrity, not knowing or practicing really much of anything about the Japanese origins of the system. Like aware that this was a system that came from Japan in the 1800s, 1900s, but not understanding what that meant. Why are these elements the way they are? What do these symbols and mantras mean from their original meaning, because the explanation I'm being given feels very Western, very Christian, very not Japanese. And I grew up with both of my parents were really connected to Japanese culture, and so I had a certain early childhood kind of steeping in a particular kind of cultural exposure to Japanese thought and so on that was really way back in my memory, and it just did not align with what what I was experiencing, and that felt out of integrity, particularly again coming from a career and a really lifelong focus on social justice and on anti-racism work and pushing back against cultural appropriation. And it was like, okay, but what are you doing over here?
My
And
God.
so, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just like, yeah, that, oh my God. Like I can imagine the dissonance, the internal
Yeah.
dissonance that was probably present there.
Yeah, dissonance is exactly the word. And so, ultimately, I found my way to a teacher who had been, studying those origins, kind of reclaiming them, um, finding the history of where this came from and what was its original purpose and why it changed. Some fascinating historical points about all of that I won't geek out on here. But the upshot being that when Reiki came into the United States in the late 1930s, um, early 1940s, in the buildup to World War II, coming through Hawaii right before the Pearl Harbor bombing, it was a real dicey time for a Japanese woman who was a Hawaiian citizen to be bringing this Japanese spiritual practice into the country, and made some necessary changes to the structure, the philosophy, and the history, like actually changing historical points about where the system came from to make it acceptable in America at that time. And that was necessary at that time. Like we wouldn't have it if she hadn't have done that. Um, However, we are now, and have long since been in a place where like we're ready to be more honest about those things and to be more open. And so for me, there's a personal responsibility to reclaim those things. And so with that being said, from its origins, Reiki is a self practice. It is a practice of self awareness, self knowledge, of coming home to the true self, understanding ourself in connection with all of life, clearing away all of the pain and baggage and limiting beliefs and problematic behaviors that we've built up over our lifetime that keep us separated from our essential self and from each other. Ultimately, it is an enlightenment practice. It comes directly out of Japanese esoteric Buddhism and Shinto indigenous practice. And it is a distillation of those ancient and complex systems into a form that's accessible, that's elegant, that's simple in its technique, and can take us to very deep places. So again, very much, very specifically a self practice. And then observing that when we're in a practice over time that clears away all of our bullshit, really, has us, living our lives more authentically, unattached to fear, unattached to anger, rooted in gratitude and compassion for ourselves and others, and true to ourselves, that has an impact on the people around us. And that impact can be intentionalized, right? That we can be with another person in such a way that their system begins to remember also that they are also, don't have to be attached to fear and anger, that they can be rooted in gratitude, they can be true to themselves, they can be compassionate to themselves and others, which is a brief description of what it might mean to be enlightened. And so, from that perspective, we can work with other people with the system of Reiki. And there are 5 elements to the system through which we work with ourselves and with others. And the hands-on healing, the energy healing that has become the centerpiece of Western Reiki is only one of those 5.
Oh
So
my
that's
gosh,
a
you're totally blowing my mind.
distillation.
I didn't know that that was just one of 5 like branches or pillars or pieces of it, as you said. And that makes brilliant sense. That makes so much more sense. And I love the whole time you're talking, explaining like what is the purpose of it? What are we trying to do here with Reiki? I was like, oh yes, exactly the same with like the tools that I use. It was like same, just slightly different in the technique, I think. And I loved what you were saying about like originating within the self. This practice, this self practice can naturally kind of ebb and radiate out of us gently, naturally, organically, impacting those that we are connected to. And that feels so, I like how there is a branch of Reiki, the hands-on practice, that is like a very intentional, almost literal, like I am passing what is flowing through me to you through you. that feels like there's a subtle, like I think about that in a more subtle way. Like when we do our self practice, when we connect to commune with ourselves and are anchored to like a deeper sense of clarity and being,
Yeah.
that permeates all of our ways of being, that permeates every action and interaction we do. And naturally, subtly, almost like an undercurrent of like impacting those around us. So it's not as overt, but it is very much there, it's intrinsic, I think.
Yeah, and I suspect that something similar to that, happened with you when you started asking questions of the records and receiving these responses that were, as you said, not like a psychic telling you everything that they see about you from an external place, but these answers maybe welling up from inside. I remember when we talked originally, you talked about, a focus on the physical center of the body and the belly and the gut and the intuitive space there, and kind of experiencing those answers coming from that place. Does that feel similar
Yeah.
to what you experienced?
Yeah. I think what really, like that moment when I was like entering the records, learning how to read them, those first initial experiences, developing that connection, what blew my mind was that I could feel it. I could feel it inside me. I could feel a knowing deep inside me throughout my being. And I think that's why I trusted it, because I was like, oh my gosh, this is unlike anything I've ever experienced. This is not my brain saying something. This is not reading a quote by like a smart person, a wise person, and it landing here. This is not your like loved one encouraging you and saying something sweet to help you keep going. This landed deep, deep, deep. It was not in my mind. It was not in my personality, even. It was not in my heart. It was deep in my center. And it felt like that understanding, that like experience of what they were like, what I was hearing through the records was in my being, in my like center, instead of just like a fun, cute thing you can think about, So that I think is what really made me pay attention and trust it and give it like a chance, make it worthy of my time and contemplation. Because like I said, I didn't think it was real when I started. So I was like, yeah, this is just like my brain making this crap up. It's like randomly after years of only negative self-talk, suddenly, there's like some nice stuff coming through. And I guess it's just my mind saying that stuff. But no, it was like, I think that moment where I experienced it deeply in the center in a more, it wasn't even in just a physical way, it was in a comprehensive way. It was the whole thing. And I remember feeling like what is within is without, like the barrier between me and the records, me and eternity, all that is, felt like it was dissipating. So it was like a sense of like completeness,
Yeah.
oneness, that felt easy to trust, I think, or at least worthy of exploring
Yeah.
trust within that.
Yeah, I mean, like you could be speaking of Reiki like from its original intended perspective, right? All of what you just said, we could apply to both systems, and it really makes like it throws into relief for me the ways in which, as a species, humanity comes to these experiences over and over again in different times and places, in different traditions. We come to different ways of understanding what's happening. Is it records that are out in the space? Is it energy? Is it, deity? Like, what is it that is causing this sensation of this deep rooted understanding and this deep rooted sense of connection with all of life? And, it makes me reflect on the fact that on the one hand, these systems of practice, understanding them, where they come from, the specifics of them, how you use them authentically as much as possible, certainly matters, like partly to be respectful to those origins, but also for effectiveness, right? Like these are developed over time through many people taking action, observing the impact of that action, recording it, recording the outcomes, passing that along, other people building on that. And so there's an effectiveness that builds up over time when there's a system of practice. And at the same time, like that is those systems of practice are a vehicle to get to the experience that you're describing, and the vehicle matters much less than the experience. My
Yes.
teacher talks about it as signposts, that like all of those elements of the system of Reiki, the 5 elements, all of the practices that are inside of them, the Akashic records and all of the practices that are inside of that system, numerous other systems, each one of those is a signpost that's pointing us in the direction of an authentic experience of connection and our essential self. And we should respect those signposts and follow them. But if we fixate on the signpost, then that's where we're going to stay. We're going to stay right there with that one practice, that one understanding of things, and we might not move along, right? And so he talks
Yeah.
about, we're like following the signpost to the degree that it is supportive of the journey, and then releasing it when it's no longer. And so, hearing these commonalities in terms of the outcomes of what you've experienced, what you've seen others experience working with the Akashic Records, and that again, you could substitute the word Reiki, inside of that description as far as the outcome that we're looking to experience. The terminology being slightly different, right? Akashic
Yeah.
records and, the terminology associated with that. In Reiki, we would call it interconnection and non-duality and unattachment, being unattached to all of the things that are distractions from that essential experience.
Mhm.
Those words are helpful to the degree that they point us in the direction of the experience, and they're not helpful when we get fixated on them. So just
Yes.
one of the reasons I love having these kinds of conversations, because we can
Yeah.
see these different paths kind of flowing to the same place.
Yeah. Flowing to the same space, that same source. And I felt the same way when you were describing what you're doing. It's like, yeah, you could replace Reiki with Akash and it would be the same thing, which is brilliant. It's beautiful. And yeah, not getting caught up in like the color of the vehicle. That's the trick.
Yeah, and then the question is like, what vehicle or what color or what system, feels the most juicy and authentic to a certain person. And so,
Yeah.
I think it's really um, valuable to work with different systems, to work with different teachers. I've had a number of teachers across different systems.
Mhm.
And in doing that, I'm kind of following the thread of what feels like it's leading me in that direction and letting go of others that are not.
Yeah.
And, following a thread that feels good and authentic. As I said, I had this childhood connection with Japan. And then as I studied Reiki from its original perspective, particularly its Shinto indigenous perspective, I saw all of these connections with my own Celtic lineage, which is another thread that I followed for, most of my life. And so, there was just this very clear connection between the understanding of our relationship to nature and our connection with the world that felt in common from those two perspectives. And so that just feels like a good home for me, right? It's like
Yeah.
bringing those two things together in my life. And um someone else, like you, are going to find a home in a different set of, perspectives, a different set of understandings and words. But again, we're heading towards the same place. So
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. Oh, me too. Beautiful.
Yeah. One of the other things that you said in our first conversation that I felt really interesting was that people will come to you with questions, just like you had questions about your purpose.
Mm.
And in working with the records, source and answer. Um, and yet ultimately what they're really there for is that experience that you're describing of the essential self, of being connected to all of life, all of that description that you just gave. And that felt very similar again to me, that often when I'm working with clients, particularly if what they've, hired me for is a hands-on Reiki session, they're coming not so much with questions, but with pains, right? With something that they want to let go of. So whether it's a physical pain, emotional, mental pain, they're looking for the cessation of that pain. And so they book a Reiki session. And then what we're really up to, right, is clearing away everything that's in the way of them being their true self. And in the
Mhm.
process of doing that, the possibility of the cessation of that pain is very powerful, because oftentimes the pains that we're experiencing are related to being so constricted around
Hmm.
um, things that we're attached to, things that we're afraid of, things we're angry about,
Yeah.
and the way that those things can get bound up in the body and expressed through physical suffering.
Mhm.
Uh, and yet ultimately what we're there for is something deeper and wider and also more vast and open than I have this pain and I want it to go away, or I have this question and I need an answer. And
Yeah.
so I kind of loved the almost the sneakiness of that
Yeah.
in a certain sense. Not that it's manipulative, but just the
Yeah.
because we have what's in front of our consciousness, right? We have a question that we're living into and we really want an answer. We have a pain that's preventing us from living our life, that's
Yeah.
distracting us. But what's underneath that pain and that question?
Yeah. That seems like that. I like use phrases like into the deep and like seeking the roots, like trying to touch and connect with the roots of these like pain points, either mental, emotional, physical, whatever they are. It's the same. If you can touch the roots, if you can go deep into that, they tend to kind of soften, unravel. There's spaciousness within there that, and exactly, it's like you can visualize it as like a knot in the body or a constricted thing. And if you imagine like a knot with thread, if that's what your insides look like, touching it softly and allowing for like the spaciousness that comes through awareness to relax it and soften it. It's like, yeah, things dissipate naturally when you do that. And so for me, instead of putting energy into like someone's being and physicality, like you may do with Reiki, it's like the awareness of like a broader perspective, gently looking at something with awareness, non-judgment, loving compassion, that creates a spaciousness that allows us to soften and the pain to naturally like dissolve.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and spaciousness is one of the words that we most commonly use to describe the outcome, right, of this practice, and that the foundational practice within the original system, a practice called Joshin Kokyoho, a method to focus the mind. We're focusing our mind in our belly. We're focusing our mind on the connection between our physical center and the earth center, and we're literally building that spacious root system as the foundation for everything else to build on. So again, so many connections
So
between
weird. Yeah.
the language that we're using, and knowing that this language is coming from our direct experiences with these systems, right?
Yeah.
That this isn't, just about what we read about these systems, but this is the experience I've had working with these practices. And for me, that feeling of that knot unwinding and becoming more spacious and my whole body relaxing around it and feeling like there's literally more room inside for everything
Yeah.
that I'm experiencing. I don't have to numb it out. I don't have to constrict or turn away from whatever it is. I don't have to feel like I only can feel one way or the other. I can't feel both at the same time. All of
Mhm.
that gets softened, and there's more room and there's more stability, in my feeling, my body, my mind, my heart around all of that. And then when I'm with another person in a session, it's not that I'm channeling energy to them to create that experience. I'm simply being with them in that way. And then their system, which is already Reiki, right? You are already Reiki. You know, your records are already written. They don't you need anybody else to give them to you. You don't need anyone else to give you Reiki. It already is what you are. But we forget, we forget those answers that are inside. And so, being with other people from that place of remembering awakens that within them, and the healing that they're experiencing, the sensations that they experience is all self-generated, but also generated from that sense of interconnection and that sense of our point in the web of life, really being activated with all of the rest of the web, and that we're not isolated, like we're in fact extremely resourced and well supported.
Yeah.
And so, again, those are all like a lot of words to explain like a sensation, right?
Yeah.
That we can receive. And so, I thank you for this conversation. It's really been, I just love these conversations about connection between these sorts of experiences, and, really affirming that, there are many paths to that end point, and that the important thing is that, we keep our mind focused on the end point being compassion, being spaciousness, being connection. Um, and I know that that's something that you make space for when you work with other folks. So I'd love to just have you share with folks how they might work with you if this feels compelling to them, where they might find you, and how you might work with them.
Yeah. Oh, I'd love to. So I offer Akashic Record readings, and that's like the main way that I work with people. And that's a one-on-one like session where you can bring your questions, and I'll open your records with your permission and consent, and then you can ask the questions and I'll relay whatever insights or responses are coming from the records. And some people like to just do one if they just have questions that they want a different perspective on. And if there are folks who are curious and more like, I don't know, wanting the self practice that we've been talking about, learning how to carry that with you on your own, so you're not dependent on an external source to read these like records, that's when I work with people over time. And so it's Akashic record readings over time with meditation. So I'm teaching you how to meditate, cultivate your own personal practice in a way that's accessible, that you can actually do it. Because it all sounds good, but if it's not simple or accessible, we tend to fall off. So crafting a practice that's like rooted in meditation that is actually, doable for you. And it's all so uniquely personalized. Bringing those two things together is my favorite thing to do, because that is what really feels like I'm giving someone what they need to then begin and deepen their own journey by themselves. It's like helping them pack up their backpack so they can be on their way with peace and joy.
I love that. I love that you teach people how to access in their own ways, right? That again feels very aligned with how I like to work with people. Teaching is the bulk of my practice. I love working with people one-on-one, providing sessions, but I'm always like, would you like to learn a practice that you can take with you, so that, yes, I would love to see you again, but I don't want you dependent on me, right? I want you to
Exactly.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And then you also have a YouTube channel that you share really insightful videos, quite a bit of material already there. And so I would love to direct people to your channel. I'll put the link down below, but why don't you just tell us the name as well.
Yeah, it's Meena Ruchi Magic. And it's also Meena Ruchi Magic on Instagram. And I think the best way to connect, and if you're looking to dip your toes in or dive deep, is my website, which is meenaruchi.com. And I teach a free meditation class once a month. You can find that information at my website. And I also have, yeah, there's lots of goodies on my website. So all the videos that you mentioned are on my website, on my blog, and the free meditation class is there. So if you're wanting to kind of see what this is about, that's a good way to kind of take a little taste. And I have a free guided visualization too from the Akashic Records that's available if you want it there. So lots of goodness to begin.
Lots of goodness, lots of trailheads that one could step onto. I love that. So all of those links will be down below in the video description. And I look forward to continue, journeying alongside you and continuing to explore these connections. It's been really, really inspiring and generative for me to be in these conversations with you. So thank you for agreeing to share them with the wider audience on the YouTubes.
It's been such a pleasure, and I've learned so much too. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
So friends who are watching, if you have any questions for Meena about the Akashic Records, about anything that she's shared, if you know folks who might be interested in the Akashic Records or in these kinds of conversations where we're exploring the commonalities between different systems of practice, please go ahead and share this video. That's the very best way that you can support this channel and hopefully share some goodness with the people in your life. And until we meet again, wherever this conversation takes you, we hope that you are deeply provisioned for that journey. Thanks for joining us. I love you. See you next time.